What is arrested development? Arrested development is defined as a stoppage of the development of a person or a people by deliberately miseducating or diseducating them, or in some cases, not educating them at all. Essentially, it is the retardation of their intended God-given human purpose. A Juvenile's Life and a History of Arrested Development, the Robert Asafo Williams story. In the wake of the United States Supreme Court decisions in the Miller v. Alabama 2012 and Montgomery v. Louisiana 2016 rulings, respectively, which held that life without parole sentences for juveniles constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, as well as effecting retroactively, which freed hundreds of under 18 juvenile lifers throughout the nation. There arose a resounding question as to why the highest court in the land chose to stall at an under 18 age impasse, ignoring the full breadth of the scientific research it relied upon piecemeal in the Miller instance by a cabal of leading neuroscientists whose findings determined more broadly that a juvenile's brain doesn't fully develop until well into the 20s age range in terms of when a sufficient level of compunction is reached, as well as the cognitive ability to discern the long-range consequences for one's actions. And while other states such as Washington, Illinois, and others in adherence to the veracity of said science have leveled up their respective age ranges to 19 and higher, Pennsylvania has remained conspicuously mute on the issue. In light of the above stated, but with a specific focus on the social and environmental conditions, which has the greatest impact on all human development, we were moved to take a closer look at the early life of Asafo in a comparable way to not only shed some light on the specter of arrested development as it marks his adolescent years, but the more broader history of the deliberate underdevelopment and social marginalization of an entire people for a more fuller context. So while we have all been enlightened by the neuroscience concerning the developmental process of the brain of a juvenile using the case study test, we thought a retrospective on the early life of Asafo up to the present could perhaps flesh out the argument in more concrete terms. Toward that end, it would betray the pursuit of true justice if we neglected to first acknowledge the chain of historical events which has led us to this critical question of underdevelopment. Plantation slavery for blacks who were held as chattel property should therefore serve as the flashpoint of this discussion as it pertains to an entire racial group being forced into an environment of arrested development. And if the ripping away of our culture, languages, spiritual systems, etc. isn't evidence enough, the deprivation of education by policy, which marked our subjugated existence, has certainly cast a long shadow, as the reverberations are still being grappled with in the present. Even after being emancipated from centuries of plantation slavery, a whole other set of social impediments for blacks continued underdevelopment had to be endured, i.e. the Black Code laws, which facilitated post-Civil War incarceration for profit within a brutal convict leasing system, which then morphed into Jim Crowism, which perpetrated blatant discriminations against blacks along with Ku Klux Klan terror, mob lynching, segregation, redlining, gentrification, horrid medical experimentations, and neglect, including mass sterilization of unwitting blacks, etc., who have come to be more generally marginalized in every societal endeavor, example, economically, educationally, politically, etc., all while being considered 3/5 of a person. Were not these and many other indices of xenophobic-based policies against blacks contributing factors in their developmental stasis? Until now, no neuroscientific analysis can be concluded independent of the social environment of its test subjects, nor outside of an historical context. Why weren't the aforementioned epical events factored into the neuroscience research as it pertains to black juveniles in particular? There is ample evidence of the intergenerational ramifications of what Dr. Joy DeGroy has fittingly termed post-traumatic slave syndrome among black people today, especially the black youth. Furthermore, when we consider the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, along with other historical Constitution amendments as governmental efforts to redress the intentional disenfranchisement of black people, even affirmative action, which denotes the government's acknowledgement that such special measurements had to be taken to bring blacks up to pace with the rest of society, why hasn't the same been recognized with regards to the juvenile lifers who stand in the long view of such historical stagnation? Likewise, if we were to look at the life of Robert Asafo Williams, who at just 19 years of age was sentenced to life without parole, otherwise known as death by incarceration, for a 1990 second-degree murder conviction with the intent of showing the connection between the provenience of his arrested development and the criminal offense he was charged, tried, and convicted of, we would be brought face to face with a series of tragic events which delineates his formative years. For starters, Asafo was born in the fall of 1969 into a fractured family dynamic in a tiny apartment of a West Philadelphia housing project plagued by the dysfunctionality of parents who both suffered from alcohol addiction and who would become split apart by an anti-family Department of Public Assistance policy which prohibited his own father and mother from living together if his mother was to continue to qualify for the welfare stipend she was allotted once a month. With an absent father and a mother descending deeper into her addiction, Asafo, as a very young boy, would take to the streets, often shoplifting food and clothing to feed and clothe his two younger siblings. Eventually, he would drop out of elementary school in the 5th grade, and more ominously, this would begin his journey into the dreadful doldrums of the many juvenile detention centers, group homes, and placement camps scattered throughout the state of Pennsylvania, many of which have come under scrutiny, some closed down, for the very abuses that were considered normal practices during Asafo's time spent in their custody. Waynesburg Youth Development Center, YDC, situated in rural West Pennsylvania, hundreds of miles away from Asafo's hometown of Philadelphia, under the auspices of administration head Gloria Gugliotta, would expose him to the most rancorous, in-your-face racism by white adult staff members who were given the responsibility of developing youth in their care into productive young adults. Incidentally, it was no surprise when that facility was converted into an adult prison, which has since been closed, where many incidents of racist practices were reported. Other juvenile facilities, including Carson Valley in Flower Town, Silver Springs in Springfield Township, Lima Detention Center in Medea, PA, and Cornwall Heights, a penitentiary-style youth development center in Bensalem, PA, where Asafo would serve 3 separate stints, would be contributing factors in stemming his development. It should also be mentioned that saltpeter, a potassium nitrate-based chemical developed by 2 Italian scientists in 1783 for various purposes, including to prevent male erections, was later discovered to be routinely, albeit surreptitiously, injected into the food and drinks of the unsuspecting juveniles confined within almost all of Pennsylvania's juvenile facilities in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which would later be linked to erectile dysfunction, kidney disease, impotence, and other chronic ailments, which would follow many of those youth into their adult lives. And because of these experiences, Asafo's already diminished social skills exhibited in his fragmented interpersonal relationships and general interactions within the densely populated housing projects where he lived, which encompassed a 4-block radius between 44th and 48th and Fairmount and Brown Streets, a virtual black colony rife with bars, liquor stores, and other perils, including the ravages of the crack cocaine epidemic of the era and the violence it engendered, would put Asafo on a collision course with his own peers. Asafo was arrested in March of 1989 for the killing of a local drug dealer who was around the same age and who, not unlike Asafo, was himself playing the hand he was dealt within a broader social dynamic and environment where an every man for himself sentiment with very few options was the prevailing mindset, and violence was virtually normalized. In fact, it was within this very environment where Asafo himself was shot multiple times on 3 separate occasions, even watched many of his childhood friends felled by violence or from drug overdoses. To say that Asafo suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that comes with such experiences would be a gross understatement. And to add to this tragedy, he never even got to enjoy a consistent, healthy, intimate relationship, which includes one of the most fundamental pillars of being human, which is to procreate. And with over 33 years served on a death by incarceration DBI sentence, his lineage has, by dint, been condemned to the same fate. To bring this into clearer focus, keep in mind that at 19, Asafo was less than a year and a half removed from the parole eligibility rulings favorable to scores of his juvenile lifer peers who met the politically correct under 18 age requirement, which as it stands hasn't come without its many contradictions, especially given the fact that the very determinant 18 as an age to mark adulthood has its origins in an era when blacks were considered property and excluded from the freedoms of the white societal order, where in fact the pejorative term boy for black males, no matter their age, was in common usage. Furthermore, if we were to look closely at today's coded legal jargon used to rationalize the handling of blacks trapped within the American legal system, we would see that it isn't all that dissimilar from the derisive rhetoric used in a much darker period in this country's sordid history, as it was aimed at blacks to justify placing them in bondage. At the turn of the 20th century, for instance, Atabinga, when he was a very young man, was kidnapped from his village in the south central African country of the Congo and brought to America to be placed in a Bronx Zoo exhibit with apes. An article in the September 9, 1906 edition of the New York Times quoted one of the most vindicated leading scientists, Harvard professor Louis Agassiz, as saying, "Blacks are a separate race, a degraded race, and a degenerate race." Whites showed up by the hundreds of thousands to enjoy the spectacle. Interestingly enough, Asafo's trial judge, the now disgraced William J. Manfredi, just before announcing Asafo's life without parole, death by incarceration sentence, admonished that given Asafo's troubled upbringing, broken home dynamic, lack of a formal education, etc., the sentence he was about to impose was an inevitable conclusion to his life. Conversely, if we juxtapose that with the case of Ethan Couch, a suburban white kid from Burleson, Texas, who was given a slap on the wrist for the 2013 killings of 4 people and the near death of 9 others by using an invented defense that has come to be known as affluenza, where it was successfully argued that because he is the son of affluent parents and therefore spoiled, he couldn't possess the normal social worldview of regular folk and therefore shouldn't be held accountable. When blacks assert the opposite as an argument, it is dismissed as absurd. And there are countless other similar instances of the same all around this country and throughout history, for it reflects the stark disparities between the handling of one group of people versus another. So much so, in fact, in light of the Miller versus Alabama decision, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services allocated hundreds of millions of dollars to the state of Delaware to be used to conduct an investigative study on post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as it affects the youth in its urban centers. Yet Pennsylvania hasn't even acknowledged its other juvenile lifers still suffering the cruel and unusual punishment that the Eighth Amendment protects against. A similar rationale is used in prohibiting persons under 21 from purchasing alcoholic beverages. As well, we found that Pennsylvania juvenile facilities themselves have a long-standing practice of mandating that some juveniles be held in their custody until they turn 21, not 18. Even with Pennsylvania state prisons, they offer a special snack portion of food for persons they consider juveniles up until they turn 21. This is outlined quite explicitly on the PADOC's Special Diets menu. How are we to come to terms with the fact that 18 as a cutoff age for adulthood has been rendered obsolete in many other states, including Washington, 19, Connecticut, 21, and Illinois, 19, but not in Pennsylvania? In Germany, it has been 21 since 1953, and in Switzerland, it's 25, which is to say, if Asafo and those similarly situated were in any of those other states or countries, they'd be eligible for parole and most likely home by now. What is it then about Pennsylvania's other juvenile lifers that disqualifies them from such justice? Moreover, who, in good conscience, which is often touted as the cornerstone of American justice, can deny that Asafo has suffered from the kind of developmental issues that should be considered along with the broader historical factors mentioned for resentencing as a juvenile? Beyond trying to make sense of the artificial and ideological fault lines regarding the political shape-shifting of exactly which ages constitutes adulthood, as well as the judicial flippancy which plagues his appeals, Asafo has used his time spent in prison to not only educate himself, but to teach others as well. In fact, he was given the name Asafo, Fighter for the People, by a community elder because of his demonstrated willingness to fight for and protect others. He also displayed a genuine contrition for the crime he committed, recognizing that not only has it hurt the family of the victim, but the very community they shared. He has, quite miraculously, reconstructed his family, both biological and communal, and today he is loved and respected and supported by his family community and his freedom is our priority. The Free Asafo Committee can be reached via Nan Hill at nanhill925@gmail.com. Again, nanhill925@gmail.com. Thank you for your time and attention.